She has not worked a day since college, and now she is stealing from her own dead mother.
That is what my father said under oath to a jury of 9 people who had known him since before I was born. I did not flinch. I did not turn. I took a sip from the plastic cup of water in front of me. Metallic, lukewarm. The kind of water that tastes like the pipes have been rusting since the courthouse was built in 1974. And I set it back down on the wooden rail without a sound. My name is Elena Vance. I am 41 years old, and up until 9 seconds ago, I was sitting in a witness box in Fairfax County Circuit Court, listening to my father describe a woman I barely recognised. Now I am watching him wave a manila folder at the jury like it is a battle flag, his face the colour of brick dust, his voice filling every corner of a room that smells like old wood and cheap cologne. He does not know what is inside the sealed envelope sitting in my attorney's briefcase. Not yet. I learned the hard way that in the Vance family, silence was never seen as discipline. It was seen as guilt. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Like they were looking right at you but only saw the version of you they invented? Let me know your story down in the comments. I would love to know who was part of our community. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there, my spine a rigid line against the hard back of the witness chair, watching Robert Vance dismantle 20 years of my life with the practiced ease of a man
who had never once been told he was wrong. He wasn't just my father. In his head, he was the king of this county. He was the man who ran the local council for 3 decades, the man whose opinion determined which roads got paved and which families were respectable. And to him, I was the daughter who ran away. The girl who chose a generic office job in Washington, D.C. over the legacy of the family land. She is a ghost, Robert told the jury, his voice booming with that false authority he used to dominate Sunday dinners. Ask anyone in our town. Ask the neighbours. Elena hasn't been seen in 15 years. She says she works for some logistics group, but there is no office. There is no website. My investigators found nothing but a blank space where a career should be. She has spent her life living off the scraps her mother threw her. And now that my wife is gone, she wants to bleed us dry. I watched my sister Ashley, sitting in the gallery. She was 7 years younger, wearing a designer cardigan I knew I had paid for through a discreet gift fund 3 years ago. She kept her eyes on her lap, playing the part of the grieving, betrayed sibling perfectly. Robert had been whispering in her ear for months, feeding her the narrative that I was a parasite, and she had swallowed it whole. Or at least the version of it that came with a bigger share of the inheritance. Inside me, the anger wasn't hot. It was clinical. It was the same cold, detached focus I used when I was coordinating extraction teams in hostile territory. I looked at the back wall of the courtroom and realised they had truly erased me. Back at the farmhouse, Robert had conducted a systematic cleansing. He'd sent out letters to everyone we knew, the pastor, the hardware store owner, the selectman, claiming I was a professional houseguest who refused to grow up. I remembered the last time I stood in that house. Right after the funeral, I walked into the hallway to find the space where my university honours and my ROCC commissioning portrait used to hang. There was nothing there but a faded patch of wallpaper and a cheap calendar from a local tractor dealership. It was as if I were a phase he had outgrown and discarded. That is the validation gap, that hollow ache when the people who raised you decide your worth is 0 because they cannot see the power you hold. Miss Vance, Robert's attorney, Gerald Davis, approached me with a smirk. Can you provide this court with a single verifiable piece of evidence that you have held gainful employment at any point in the last decade? A pay stub, a tax return, anything that isn't a shadow? I looked at him, then at my father. Robert was leaning back, his arms crossed, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He thought he had me cornered in a world of paper trails and public records.
I work in operations analysis, I said, my voice level and dangerously quiet. My clients value discretion. The records exist, but your lack of access to them is not my failure. It is your limitation. Robert let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the wood-panelled walls. Discretion? You were a paper pusher, Elena, a glorified clerk. Don't try to dress up your laziness with big words. I felt the silver phoenix pin pressing against my chest. He had no idea that while he was complaining about the price of feed at the diner, I was sitting in windowless rooms at Langley, making decisions that shifted the borders of nations. I had spent 15 years in the shadows, accepting their insults and their pity, because the alternative was a breach of national security. But today, the silence was about to end.
Robert sat there with a smirk that made my skin crawl. To him, my life was a blank balance sheet. To him, the fact that I wasn't visible meant I didn't exist. He truly believed that a woman's success was measured by how well she served a man's legacy, or how loud she was at a town hall meeting. The cost of silence, I thought, adjusting my posture in the witness box. That is the phrase we use in the agency. It is the price you pay for being the shield. When you are good at what I do, nobody knows your name. You don't get a parade. You don't get a plaque. You get a grey room and a secure line. And sometimes you get a family who thinks you are a failure because you cannot show them a shiny trophy. They had no idea that for 15 years I had been the silent architect of their comfort. When the dairy farm's irrigation system failed in 2018, and Robert was staring at a 6-figure loss, he thought he'd caught a lucky break with a private agricultural grant. It wasn't luck. It was $136,000 of my combat pay, funneled through 3 shell companies I'd set up, just so he wouldn't have to feel the shame of taking money from a daughter he'd already written off.
I paid for Ashley's master's degree under the guise of an anonymous alumni scholarship. I paid for my mother's experimental treatments when the insurance company folded. I was the ghost in their bank accounts, the invisible hand keeping their world from collapsing. And yet, here they were, using the very secrecy I maintained to protect them as a weapon to destroy me. "Tell us, Elena." Gerald Davis leaned in, his breath smelling of stale coffee and unearned confidence. "Since you're so successful in this mysterious office, why did your mother feel the need to include an active employment clause in her trust? Was it because she knew her eldest daughter was a drifter? A woman who preferred the shadows of DC to the honest work of a farm?" I looked at the jury. They were nodding. In a small town, honest work means callous hands. It doesn't mean sitting in a skiff at Fort Meade analysing intercept logs. "My mother understood the nature of my work better than anyone in this room," I said, my voice cutting through the air like a cold front. "She knew that my life required me to be invisible. She built that clause not to punish me, but to protect the trust from people who would try to claim I wasn't contributing to society just because they couldn't see the results on a local news feed." Robert let out a sharp, barking laugh. "Contributing to society? You were a clerk, Elena. You sat at a desk and pushed paper while your sister stayed here and actually cared for this family."
You're not a martyr. You're a ghost who's tired of being hungry. I watched him. This was the man who told me when I was 12 that I was a phase, not a future. He believed that because I was a woman. My only path to power was through marriage or a loudmouth. He couldn't conceive of a world where I held more authority than the entire county council combined. "This isn't about the money, is it, Robert?" I asked, dropping the dad entirely. The room went still. "This is about control. You couldn't control where I went, so you've decided to rewrite where I've been. I am showing the world who you really are." He shouted, his face turning that dangerous shade of purple. I leaned forward just a fraction. Careful when you go looking for the truth in the dark. You might not like what looks back at you. Gerald Davis didn't like my answer. He adjusted his silk tie, a desperate attempt to regain the upper hand in a room that was starting to feel heavy. He turned back to the jury, his voice dripping with rehearsed sympathy for the victim. My father. "The defence talks about shadows and secrets," Davis said, pacing in front of the jury box. "But let's look at the facts. We have a report here from a professional investigator. No North Atlantic Logistics Group exists at the address listed on the defendant's tax filings. It's a P.O. box at a UPS store. We have no record of Eleanor Vance ever paying into a corporate health plan. No LinkedIn, no digital footprint." He stopped and pointed a finger at me. "The truth is simpler. Eleanor is a ghost because she has nothing to show. Ashley, would you please step forward?" My sister stood up. She walked to the stand with a practiced fragility.
Her eyes red-rimmed. She looked at the jury like she was sharing a painful family secret. "Elena always had a way of making us feel small," Ashley whispered. "She'd disappear for months, then come back talking about big contracts and important people. But whenever Mum needed help with the mortgage or the medical bills, it was always me. Elena would just say she was between cycles. Then, after Mum passed, I found the bank statements. Thousands of dollars withdrawn from Mum's personal account. Signatures that didn't look like Mum's at all. It broke my heart to realise my big sister was using our mother's dementia to fund her important life in DC. I felt a phantom chill. Forgery. They were actually going for forgery. Ashley was a third-grade teacher who spent her weekends at wine tastings, yet here she was playing the role of the martyr. She didn't mention that the thousands of dollars were actually reimbursements for the private nurses I had hired. Nurses Robert refused to pay for because he didn't believe in strangers in the house. Robert sat behind his lawyer, nodding solemnly. He looked like a man who had already won. He'd spent decades building a cathedral of lies in this town, and he was finally putting the roof on it. "Your Honour," Davis said, his voice reaching a theatrical crescendo.
"We move to enter Exhibit 12, a comprehensive background search and a sworn statement from a forensic document examiner suggesting that the signatures on these trust withdrawals are fraudulent. It is clear that Elena Vance has not only failed the employment clause, but has actively defrauded the estate to maintain a lifestyle she never earned." The jury looked at me with cold, hard eyes. To them, I was the city girl who forgot her roots and stole from the dead. The indignation in the room was a physical weight, but I didn't reach for my lawyer's hand. I didn't look at Robert. Instead, I looked at the door at the back of the courtroom. "Is that all?" I asked quietly. "Is that all?" Robert barked from his seat. "You've been caught, Elena. You're a thief and a liar." "Mr. Vance, sit down," Judge Miller warned, though his tone was unusually distracted. He was staring at the phoenix pin on my lapel again. I turned to my attorney, Marcus Thorne. Marcus wasn't a local guy. He didn't wear cheap cologne or save his good blazer for funerals. He was a man who wore a suit like armour, and he'd spent 20 years in the JAG Corps before entering private practice for specialised clients like me. Marcus stood up. He didn't pace. He didn't perform for the jury. He just opened his briefcase. "Your Honour," Marcus said, his voice a calm, rhythmic bass that silenced the room.
The plaintiff's investigation was thorough by civilian standards, but it was looking for a person who, for the sake of national security, is not permitted to exist in public databases. Since the plaintiff has raised the issue of criminal fraud, my client has been granted a limited waiver under Title 10, Section 144. He pulled out a single heavy black envelope. It was sealed with wax embossed with the gold eagle of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. We would like to introduce a verified statement of service and employment status, pre-authorised for judicial review.
The smirk on Robert's face didn't disappear immediately. It flickered like a dying light bulb. Gerald Davis frowned, stepping forward to peer at the envelope. "What is that?" Davis asked, his confidence finally cracking. "ODNI? That has nothing to do with a trust dispute." "It has everything to do with it," Marcus replied. Marcus Thorne stepped toward the bench with the black envelope, and the energy in the room curdled. I watched Judge Miller. He wasn't just a judge today. He was a man staring at a ghost from his own past. "Counselor." Miller's voice was a low rasp. "You are asserting that this document contains information classified under the highest level of national security." "I am, Your Honour," Marcus said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat.
Furthermore, the Office of the General Counsel for the CIA has authorised a limited disclosure to this court. It confirms the defendant's continuous active employment for the last 15 years. It also clarifies the nature of the North Atlantic Logistics Group. Robert stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "This is a stunt. She's a clerk. I've seen her apartment. I've seen her life. She's nobody." "Sit down, Mr. Vance," Miller barked, not even looking at him. His eyes were locked on me, specifically on the silver phoenix pin on my lapel. I remembered that pin. It wasn't jewellery. It was a service recognition insignia given to those who operated in the grey spaces. Miller knew it because he had been a colonel in the Marine Corps. He had seen that pin in briefing rooms in Baghdad and skiffs in Virginia. He knew that the woman sitting in the witness box wasn't a drifter. The judge took the envelope. He used a silver letter opener, his movements slow and deliberate. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the old fluorescent lights. Robert was breathing heavily, his face a mottled purple. Ashley was chewing her lip, her eyes darting between the judge and me. Miller removed the document. He read it once, then he read it again. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. He took off his glasses and set them on the bench. When he looked up, his face was no longer that of a tired county judge. It was the face of an officer. "Mr. Davis," Miller said, his voice echoing with a new, terrifying weight. "You have built a case on the premise that Elena Vance is a ghost. You have accused her of fraud, of theft, and of laziness." He paused, his gaze shifting to my father. "I have before me a verified statement of service from the Director of National Intelligence. It confirms that Elena Vance holds the rank of Senior Intelligence Service Level 4. For the last decade and a half, she has served as a Director of Operations for the Central Intelligence Agency." The room didn't just go quiet, it went cold.
Robert's jaw literally dropped. Ashley let out a small, strangled sound. "The logistics group you mocked?" Miller continued, his eyes flashing with a cold fire. "That is a Tier 1 cover designation, established by the Department of Defense. The blank spaces in her records aren't evidence of her failure. They are evidence of her excellence. She wasn't hiding in DC, Mr. Vance. She was protecting the very world you live in." Miller looked at me, and for the first time in 21 years, I felt seen. Truly seen. "Bailiff," Miller said, "secure the doors. No one leaves this room. We are shifting this to an in-camera proceeding. And Mr. Davis, I suggest you start thinking about a very, very fast withdrawal of this complaint." Robert tried to speak, but his voice cracked. She was just an analyst. She told us she was an analyst." I leaned forward, my voice a whisper that felt like a blade. "I told you what you were cleared to know, Robert. You weren't asking questions because you wanted to know me. You were accepting answers because they fit the story you wanted to tell." The silence in the room was no longer heavy, numbing. Rather, Robert Vance looked like a man who had been carved from stone and then left to erode. His hands, those thick, calloused hands that had once pointed at me with such venomous certainty, were now trembling.
Gerald Davis didn't even try to object. He was staring at the floor, his professional reputation dissolving into the polished hardwood. He knew that withdrawing the complaint was no longer a choice. It was a mercy he had to beg for. Judge Miller leaned forward, his hands clasped on the bench. "I am dismissing this complaint with prejudice," he stated, each word landing like a gavel strike. "Furthermore, the court is issuing sanctions against the plaintiff in the amount of $45,200 for legal fees and the administrative burden placed upon the Department of Defense. And Mr. Vance, I am awarding the defendant $50,000 in damages for defamation of character, to be paid immediately from your personal share of the family estate." Robert's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He looked at Ashley. She had turned away from him, her face buried in her hands. The alliance of convenience had shattered the moment the stakes became real.
"Elena," Robert finally managed to croak. "We didn't know. How are we supposed to know?" I stood up. I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I usually felt after a successful operation. I just felt clean. "You weren't supposed to know the details, Robert, but you were supposed to know me. You were supposed to know that the daughter who worked 10-hour days in the fields as a child didn't just turn into a leech because she moved to a different city." I walked toward the gallery. As I passed my father, I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I was moving at the same pace I had moved for 15 years. Forward, purposeful, and entirely out of his reach. "The money for the nurses," I said, pausing just long enough for him to hear. "The $136,000 that saved this farm 4 years ago. That was me, too. I didn't do it because I loved the legacy. I did it because my mother loved you. But that debt is officially settled." I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the marble hallway of the Fairfax County Courthouse. The air was different here. Crisp, filtered, and tasting of the freedom I had earned 1,000 times over. Marcus Thorne caught up with me at the elevator. He didn't say congratulations. We don't use that word in our line of work. He just handed me my briefcase. "The director wants a debrief at 0800 tomorrow. Marcus said he was impressed by your judicial restraint." "I was just balancing the books, Marcus," I replied, as the elevator door slid open. I walked out to the parking lot and found my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, looking at the silver phoenix pin in the rearview mirror. I unclipped it and placed it in its velvet-lined box. For 15 years, I had shrunk myself to fit their narrative. I had accepted their insults as the price of my service. But as I pulled out of the lot and headed toward the sunrise over Langley, I realised I was no longer a ghost in my own story. I was the author, and the next chapter was going to be written in a language they would never understand. Never let other people's stories define your worth. If you enjoyed this ending, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic plot twists.